Informed Sources is made possible in part by Susie and Pierre G. Villery.
With a lifetime of passion for public television, we are pleased to help underwrite Informed Sources.
Please join us in supporting WYES TV.
Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, a new study shows Louisiana's freshwater wetlands receding at an alarming rate, and the culprits are the saltwater wetlands, which are being driven inland. We'll examine the cause and the implications. Clearview Mall seems to be receding too, at least as a shopping center. We'll update the latest plans for the development, and the Pelicans basketball fortunes took a big step this week, suggesting there might be a new championship team emerging in the NBA. We begin, though, by analyzing air disasters out of New Orleans, including most notably a Pan Am jet that crashed into a Kenner neighborhood 40 years ago this weekend, and what effect that had on aviation. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources: Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources; Dennis Woltering, former anchor, WWL-TV, Channel 4; Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter; and Mark Schleifstein, environmental reporter, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate. We're going to go over to Dennis first, because coming up 40 years ago this weekend was that tragic Pan American jetliner crash. As we said in the lead, it was in Kenner. You were on the scene reporting that. Tell us about it. What was it like?
Well, it was just after 4 p.m. on a Friday, July 9th, 1982, when this Pan Am flight 759, took off on the east-west runway, headed for Las Vegas. It only got up 100 to 150 feet off the ground when it was suddenly slammed by a microburst of wind shear, slammed to the ground. It crashed into the Morningside Park subdivision in Kenner. And the plane was loaded with fuel. It exploded in flames when it hit the ground. It was like a bomb hit that neighborhood. A total of 153 people, 145 on board the plane, and 8 more on the ground were killed. We were among the first crews on the scene, and it was like a war zone. I mean, flames and smoke and debris and victims, bodies everywhere. And nowadays, when something like this happens, the authorities cordon it off. I mean, the media are kept like a couple blocks, half a mile away. Back in those days, that was not the case. We were right sort of in the midst of all of this going on, and it was surreal. It was hard to take in everything that was happening. I mean, fire was shooting out of buildings, and there was smoke. Gas lines, broken gas lines were hissing, electrical lines were down, and we saw all of this debris and all of this stuff going on around us. It was really hard to take in.
And we're looking at that video. I mean, it just brings it back to you. It was horrible.
Yeah. 3 people in the neighborhood came out of there, and they had serious burns. 2 of them survived. One of them died. When they were searching this debris, and it looked like it was just a horrible field of death. They weren't finding any people alive. And then several hours after the search began, a cry went up. This Kenner police officer, Gerald Hibbs, saw some movement nearby, and he went over and checked it and moved a baby mattress aside, and there under the mattress was this baby, 16-month-old baby girl who was Melissa Trahan, and she was alive, and it was just like, it was just such an upbeat moment. There was suddenly a cheer among the searchers that they found someone alive. And Melissa Trahan, I've done stories with her since then. She is now 41 years old, has a 12-year-old daughter. She's happily married. She and her husband run a business, and she's just a delightful young woman. I mean, she said in one of the interviews I did with her that she felt like she was given a second chance at life, and she wants to make the most of that second chance at life. And it was the most upbeat moment of the whole day.
And she was called the Miracle Baby, right?
She was called the Miracle Baby.
Because it was miraculous that she survived all of this devastation.
Yeah, it was incredible. It was
and you, as a reporter, having been on that scene, I mean, this obviously has stayed with you. You remember it vividly.
It has stayed with me. Yeah, it was one of the biggest, most important stories I've ever covered. One that I will remember forever. And actually, I have interviewed her, and when I talked to her, I've gotten emotional because it was that was such a bright moment in such a dark time.
Yeah.
And she is a lovely young woman. Now, the other thing is this was wind shear.
Right.
And the pilots took off. They knew there was a thunderstorm, but they didn't know how severe it was. They didn't know about wind shear. And this wind shear hit them and just knocked the plane to the ground. A lot of research went on after that, and they found out a lot more about wind shear, but nothing was really done for several years. Then 3 years later, 1985, another plane went down in Dallas, a Delta Airlines plane, and 136 people on the plane were killed. A motorist on the highway nearby was killed. That was also wind shear. After that, they got more serious. The NTSB had been recommending that they put these wind shear detectors in airports, but nothing was really done very much. And then it was in 1993, technology was a lot better by then, and then it was mandated that airports have wind shear detectors. We had Doppler radar by then, and now they have wind shear detectors on planes as well, so it's a lot safer now. But it took 11 years before technology and orders were put in place to improve this safety system.
And for a long time, we certainly were hearing a lot about wind shear, in those years following the Pan Am crash. And that, of course, as you pointed out, the plane took off in a thunderstorm, which is not unusual here in the summer, particularly in the afternoon for a thunderstorm. So this seems, thank goodness now we do have this technology to detect this.
Absolutely. Now, there was talk about wind shear when they were taking off, but the storm was rated, they had a scale of 1 to 6 at that time, and this was rated like a 2 or 3 level storm. So it didn't seem like it was going to be dangerous for them when they took off.
So if you can just sort of recount for us, being in the newsroom, how did you all find out about this? Did it come over the police radio, or people calling in from around the area that there'd been a crash?
Well, a photographer and I were out on another story. Actually, we were in the Kenner area, so we were scrambled to the scene. But I'm sure it came over the police radio.
Yeah.
It was.
I mean, that's just something that you certainly don't expect to hear in any kind of situation. I mean, certainly the community doesn't, but when you're in a news operation, hearing about something like this is just a major, major, major event, which it was.
Actually, I talked to the air traffic controller who spoke to the pilots before they were taken off. He was the last man to talk to the pilots before they took off, and he said that they saw the plane lifting off. He said it looked like a flat takeoff. He described it as a flat takeoff, and then they saw this huge explosion. And he said it's like they couldn't believe it. He said one of the other air traffic controllers tried to call the pilots, on the radio, like they just couldn't believe what they had seen. It was just a horrific episode. And
then the jet was going to, what was its destination? Was it Las Vegas?
Las Vegas.
Flying us to Las
Vegas.
Vegas. And went down in that Kenner neighborhood. I mean, it is, for those of us who were around at that time, it is unforgettable.
Yeah.
It definitely is.
Dennis, back to Melissa Trahan. I assume she lost her family too. Was there much family there at the time?
I should have mentioned that. Yeah, she lost her mother and her sister, 4-year-old sister, died in the crash. They were in the house. Her father was at work at the time, so he wasn't killed. He wasn't involved. But she named her baby Melanie after her mother, and she says she's trying to keep her mother's spirit alive.
Now, didn't you have years later a reunion with her and the policeman that found her?
I did, yeah. We had a reunion with Gerald Hibbs and Melissa, and it was a very, very emotional reunion. I mean, for all of us, for me as well.
How many years later was this?
That was on the 20th anniversary. It was 20 years ago, and I'll never forget this. First of all, Melissa's father was not sure he wanted her to go on camera to talk to us. And her grandparents said, let her make the decision. And she decided she wanted to go on and talk about it. And so we did the story, and she called me up and said she liked the story. And she said, I get emotional when I talk about this, but she said, her roommate said, did you cry when you met Mr. Hibbs and everything? And she said, no, but Mr. Woltering did.
Well, Mr. Woltering really did feel it, didn't he? I mean, you still do to this day, I can see, Dennis, because it was such a traumatic event, and it's something we never want to see repeated anywhere.
Oh, my God.
Certainly not in our own community.
And I want to say that Missy Trahan is going to be speaking at 10 a.m. tomorrow at a memorial. There's a memorial for the victims next to the next to the church in Rivertown, and she's going to be speaking at that memorial at 10 a.m. tomorrow.
Okay, I'm glad that we know about that. And thanks, Dennis, for recounting all of that to us. I know, Errol, you wanted to touch on a little bit, too, about some other aircraft incidents here.
Yeah, well, there have been several airplane crashes, but involving commercial passenger airlines. There have been 3. Actually, one of them has a happy ending, okay? But the other 2, of course, were real disasters. One was in February '64. This was an Eastern Airlines plane, and as it was taking off, it just crashed into the lake. Just never really got attitude, and it crashed into the lake. It was heading, they used to have what they call the milk run flights. It started in Mexico City, went to New Orleans, it was going to Atlanta, then to Washington, and then finishing the day at Kennedy in New York. But that was blamed ultimately on an equipment failure. In '67, there was a flight, it was a training flight, and this was for Delta Airlines, and it had like a crew of 5 people and a supervisor who were doing training, and they were going in for landing, and something happened, and it went over into Airline Highway, and it actually crashed into the Hilton Motel there,
Right.
and some of the other buildings, and that was blamed on really a supervisor error. But the really kind of interesting story, that should be a movie one day, I guess, was in May of 1988, a TACA Airlines flight. That was the airline that used to service Central America, was coming into New Orleans, a 737. That's the kind of plane that Southwest Airlines uses, if you're familiar with that. It was ascending into New Orleans, and it got caught into a hailstorm. Both of its engines just flamed out, and so it was ascending, and it had no engines working. So they're gliding. The pilots know they can't make it to New Orleans International. They're somewhere in New Orleans East, and so they're deciding to have to ditch it in the Gulf of Mexico or in the marshlands. As they're descending, preparing to do one of those 2 things, the pilot at the last moment notices a levee right by Michoud, and he lands the plane on the levee by Michoud. Nobody was killed, and the plane was still usable. Ultimately, they towed the plane to Michoud, where there was a landing strip, and were able to fly it back and all of that. Curiously,
That is pretty amazing.
Curiously, even more amazing, the pilot was 29 years old, and he only had one eye. He'd been flying in El Salvador, and there had been like a civil war going on, and he got caught a stray bullet. So you had a one-eyed 29-year-old pilot who did this really, really heroic effort. So at least there was one great story from all of this.
That is really a tremendous story. And that was a commercial airliner?
Yeah, that was TACA. That was the old Central American.
Right.
The plane lasted for a long time, and ultimately it was sold to Southwest Airlines, and it lasted, I think, until into the 1980s. And so it was a durable plane.
So you're going to write the screenplay for that story? All right, Eve, thanks a lot. Mark, let's go on over to you, and let's talk about our environment, which is threatened. And you had a piece the other day about a study that said that the saltwater wetlands are intruding into the freshwater wetlands, and that's a problem.
Yeah, well, it's will be intruding, not yet. Well, it is somewhat yet, but I mean somewhat now, but the real problem is in the future. The basis of this is that the researchers from U.S. Geological Survey, actually at the Lafayette Wetlands Research Center, did this study to see what the potential was from not the worst case sea level rise caused by global warming, but one step down. So it's not where we think we're going to go, but it's one step above that if we're not able to keep things at 2 degrees above 2 degrees centigrade above where we should be. And the problem is that if that does occur, the water levels in the Gulf of Mexico, actually around the world, will rise by about 4.9 feet. And then you add to that the subsidence that's occurring in Louisiana, and the result is that by 2100, they estimated that the state would have about 4,000 square miles of wetlands that would move inland. And there is room for it to move inland, those saltwater wetlands that are on the shoreline that are very important for fisheries. But the problem is that they would take over what is now freshwater wetlands in most areas. And those freshwater wetlands also would move farther inland, but they would be running into things like levees and populated areas, farmland, things like that. So not as much of the freshwater wetlands will be able to escape. A significant reduction in freshwater wetlands would occur, and that's a significant problem. The other thing that this study looked at was the absolute worst case. If indeed all efforts at reducing greenhouse gases fail, by 2100, we're looking at along the Louisiana Gulf Coast as much as 10 feet above present water levels for water, and that's significant.
It is.
Let's hope it doesn't happen. We're already seeing at least some efforts that have been successful at reducing greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, but we're far away from it. And right now, with rising gas prices and the use of natural gas for overseas, we're actually seeing a little bit backsliding worldwide on efforts to reduce climate change.
Mark, what are some of the differences between saltwater wetlands and freshwater wetlands in terms of like the aquatic growth and the fisheries and what you could
sure.
to find?
The easy one is the kinds of fish that you would find there. The saltwater wetlands, you're much more likely to find red drum, redfish that are a key resource, and the different kinds of shrimp that we find here in Louisiana spend their juvenile life and their adult life in saltwater. So when you move everything back, that causes problems, and then the freshwater fish that you see are bass and trout that you see in streams and upland streams. So that's going to be a change that will occur.
So this would be a major impact, what you're saying, on aquatic life in our area.
Yeah, it will be, and it'll be a difference in the kinds of wetlands themselves and also the kinds of other things that live in wetlands. One of the concerns for the saltwater moving that far inland is what that will do to the present oyster beds, which already, ironically, are already threatened by freshwater from the proposed mid-Barataria sediment diversion, which will increase the fresh water in that same area that they're talking about the saltwater rising in. So it's going to be very difficult to figure out exactly how quickly this will occur over the next 80 years and what the complete effects will be.
We look at wetlands as a buffer also protecting us from storms, so we would see less wetlands if this happens.
Well, that's true. We're expecting to see less wetlands over the next 80 years anyway.
Yeah.
But as the saltwater wetlands move inland, there are concerns that they may not be able to survive in rising waters, be able to keep up with the water rise levels, and that could be a problem as well. Those wetlands serve as a first buffer for storm surge coming in on levees.
So this is, certainly it impacts Louisiana, but other coastal areas too, right?
Exactly. Louisiana has the most wetlands at risk, but next is Florida, then North Carolina, Texas, and several other states along the East Coast. The West Coast, there's much more height involved in quickly rising water, so it's not going to have as much of an effect there.
Okay. All right, Mark. Well, thanks a lot. Let's now move on over to Dawn. And Clearview Mall is the shopping center. It's definitely gone through some changes.
Major changes, actually, the biggest of which was announced on the mall's 50th birthday, which was back in 2019. It used to be one of the suburban malls like Lakeside and Oakwood and Esplanade. Lakeside really holds the market, both in our area and around the region and the nation, for a suburban shopping mall, traditional structure that actually still works and has lots of people shopping in it. Clearview is being reimagined. They announced these changes back in 2019. Even though they haven't had a whole lot of foot traffic up until 2019, they have had a coup with Target, Bed Bath & Beyond, and the AMC movie theater. They haven't had other stores that draw people, but they've drawn enough to survive with just those 3 stores. So now there's a whole reimagining that includes those 3 things: the movie theater, Bed Bath & Beyond, and Target. Target's getting a change up right now. It will have new storefront, bigger pickup area, some more in-store kind of fun options like an Ulta makeup counter and things they're doing at other Targets around the country. Those changes are underway right now and are expected to be finished before the holiday shopping season this Christmas time. The biggest thing you'll notice is massive cranes in the air kind of construction at Clearview right now. And what that is the Ochsner Super Clinic. And the Super Clinic will start out when it opens supposedly later this year, although I think it's going to maybe looking like it might go a little later than that. But it will open with 42 physicians, nurse practitioners, and physician's assistants doing all sorts of things. It's kind of your one-stop shopping for care and wellness and that sort of thing. Men's and women's health, behavioral health, sports medicine, brain health, pain management, cardiology. It's the kind of healthcare center that has not been that close to that area of Metairie. It's supposed to draw 300 new medical type jobs in addition to the construction jobs that are going along with it. This is more than what we've heard about in other parts of the country with a lifestyle center. There's the Super Clinic, the shopping center, which will ultimately get more stores, more restaurants, and more entertainment type venues in that area underneath the movie theater. But then the next phase of this planned redevelopment is called the Metro, and that is a 5-story, $55 million apartment complex with 270 different apartment units, about 920 square feet each. So there will be housing, there will be medical, there will be entertainment, there will be shopping. There were supposed to be announced already plans for a hotel on the site. The pandemic kind of pushed that back a little bit. Those plans are expected to be announced sometime later this year. There should still be a hotel coming, but one hasn't been announced yet. If you have not driven by the Clearview area lately, it's a sight to see. Lots of new buildings, lots of new construction, lots of changeover. You know, the parking lot will be reimagined too with landscaping. Target is still open, but it looks a little crazy from the outside right now.
And Bed Bath & Beyond still
and Bed Bath
open
& Beyond and the movie theater.
And there's some other little shops.
And there's
there
some
too,
little
some
shops
smaller shops
and
still
restaurants. And the first
Right.
new thing that actually went up in that area was a Regions Bank, which is fully functional on the corner there, right off of Veterans Highway.
Has the housing construction started yet?
That has not started.
Okie doke. And when is that supposed to?
You know, I'm not sure when that
Okay.
is going to kick off yet.
Okie doke. But that's in the future too. for Clearview.
Yeah, it will be a totally changed. It will not be another suburban shopping mall. It will be a totally changed area.
All righty, Dawn. Thanks a lot. All righty. Now let's go on over again to Errol. And yeah, we've been getting a lot of Pelicans news. It all seems to be pretty good at this point.
Well, yeah. What happened this week is that the Pelicans came to terms with Zion Williamson. You know, a few months ago, it was looking up, because like he didn't play at all this past season, and there was a lot of speculation he didn't want to be in New Orleans. People remember the Anthony Davis fiasco where you draft this big star and they want to go to a bigger market. So he didn't seem like he wanted to play. Well, the last few months he's been very, very obvious he wants to be in New Orleans. I mean, talk about a real love letter to New Orleans, everything he can say about it. And for good reason, I guess, because he signed a contract. Essentially, and NBA contracts are sort of complicated because they have all kind of bonuses and incentives and all that. But roughly, it's for $231 million over a 5-year period. That's pretty good pay.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, you know,
I'll take it.
We'd take it, wouldn't we?
yeah. And then there's, but one thing that's encouraging is in these complicated contracts, they have some sort of like opt-out clauses where a player can get out of it. Well, he didn't want to do the opt-out. I mean, he wanted to make the statement that he's here, and so it seems like he is. His family's here. His family wants to stay, and so and he's going to pack arenas. I mean, not only the arena here, but all around the league, and so he's going to be a really financial boom for the whole league. When Anthony Davis was traded to the Lakers, the Pelicans made a very complex trade, where the Lakers got Anthony Davis and the Pelicans got like 6 players. And out of that, 3 of them are starters now. And so people are looking at that trade between the Lakers and the Pelicans and saying, I think the Pelicans got the better deal out of this. And so to dupe the Lakers is kind of a badge of honor right there.
Well, we saw the Pelicans really ramp it up toward the end of their season.
At the end of the season, they got into the playoffs just barely, but they played against Phoenix in the first round. Phoenix had the top record in all the NBA this past season, and nobody expected the Pelicans to win that series. They didn't, but they won 2 out of the 6 games, and so people were impressed with that, and so they showed a lot of promise. And so I think next year there's reason to kind of have a lot of excitement about the team.
It really does sound like it. Okay, well, looking forward to that. All righty, guys, other stories. And E, we're going to stay with you.
Well, something else to look forward to is a documentary that's coming on this week, produced by Marcia.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
Friendship and Freedom, the National World War II Museum. This is the story of the museum. And I got to tell you, the museum story is really, really interesting. It goes back to Stephen Ambrose, and who's a World War II historian, and his vision. And originally it was going to be the D-Day Museum, and then Nick Mueller, who is a history professor out at UNO, and his vision, they got together. And a lot of people just really got involved in this process. And originally, remember, it was going to be on the lakefront.
Right.
And the documentary talks about why it moved downtown. But it's an interesting story, and the museum is a very, very important museum.
It's a very important museum.
And congratulations, Marcia, for doing it. Marcia, when is it?
It's this Monday. It premieres 7 o'clock on WYES. And then it'll have, that's July 11th, and then it'll have several of their airings. And it's founded on friendship and freedom, and the reason why the friendship is because the friendship between those 2 guys, how they believed in one another, and they thought this was an important project, and they really, made it happen. So it's an interesting story. It was fun to do with them.
And Ambrose also had a lot of access to Dwight Eisenhower.
Right, he did.
In Eisenhower's paper, which is just a wealth right there, especially if you're writing about World War II. So it's going to be an important documentary.
Okay, thanks a lot for the plug, E. Okay, quickly now, Dennis, other stories, real quick.
Well, coming up tomorrow is Royd Anderson made a documentary about the Pan Am crash, and it's airing at Jefferson Parish Library's first screening on the West Bank at Manhattan at 9:30 a.m., and then the second screening at 1:30 p.m. at the East Bank Regional Library on West Napoleon.
Okay.
It'd be good to see.
Mark, over to you, real quick.
Yeah, so the Press Club of New Orleans is still giving out scholarships to kids who graduated from New Orleans area high schools. We're giving out 3 $2,500 scholarships, and you can apply if you're a rising sophomore, junior, or senior. And you can apply at pressclubneworleans.com.
Okay, Dawn?
Another area of town that's getting a major facelift is the aquarium. Those renovations are underway to move the butterfly garden and insectarium to the aquarium. That shouldn't be complete, though, till 2024.
And it's going to be great. All right, guys, thanks a lot for being here. Thank you for joining us, too. See you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.
Informed Sources is made possible in part by Susie and Pierre G. Villery.
With a lifetime of passion for public television, we are pleased to help underwrite Informed Sources.
Please join us in supporting WYES TV.